Hi everyone, this is my personal psychology, and this episode is about the psychological research on patients. I'm aware that this video is a bit longer, and so I thought I'll first give you an overview of all the topics that I'll talk about, so that if you're interested in something, in just one thing, you have a particular interest in one topic, then you can just forward to that. You can do that by going to the description underneath my video and just checking the chapter that interests you and click on it. And so the topics of this episode are going to be the following. First, I will differentiate patients from other psychological variables or constructs that also are important in psychology, namely delay of gratification and self-control. Then I'll talk about the patient's questionnaire, by which the research that I will tell you about in this episode was done. I will introduce the questions, how the questionnaire was done and what it all means. Then I'll talk about patience and other character strengths, patience and personality, patience, self-control, mindfulness, and affect. Then about the dimensions of patience. That's actually from a new patience questionnaire that distinguishes several dimensions, and so we can have a more differentiated look at patience and its relationships. First to personality, but then also to well-being, and also even to patience in general and the pursuit of goals. And then last but not least, we will talk about patience training, by which also you can become more patient. So yeah, I really hope that you will find something that is of interest to you and hopefully even of value. And I really hope that you will enjoy this episode. So now we turn to the psychology of patients. And the first thing that I've noticed when I was looking at psychological research on patients is just how different the Western conception of patient seems to be from the Chinese conception that we've just discussed. So in psychological research, there seems to be much more research on terms or concepts that are quite close to patients, but I would argue aren't quite patients, and we will get to that. But I would say that the concepts in psychology that are most researched and are closest to patients are delay of gratification and self-control. So I will just very quickly introduce you to these concepts so that then I can explain or argue why I think they're not quite the same and differentiate them from patients. So delay of gratification is a term that has been introduced by the psychologist Walter Mischel. He is also the author of the now very famous marshmallow experiment that you might have already heard. So I will just give you a quick introduction. So small children have been given a marshmallow, and they have been told that if they would be able to wait 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow, they would get a second marshmallow. And some children were able to wait and delay gratification, and some children weren't and just ate it much earlier. But the really interesting insight was found only much later, when the researchers had contacted the children again when they were actually already adults. So what they found is that those those adults that as children were able to delay gratification had much better life outcomes, you could say. So they were less likely to be addicted, they were healthier, they were in a better financial situation, etc., etc. So that's an important insight for itself. But I would argue it's not quite the same as patience, but we'll get to that. And the second, also quite well researched concept is called self-control. You might argue it's, well, almost the same or the same as delayed gratification. I've just made the distinction because there's been another psychologist, Roy Baumeister, who has done a lot of research in this area. And what he has found in many experiments is that self-control is actually comparable to a muscle. So not literally, it's not literally a muscle in your brain, but it is analogous in two ways. So in the first way, it's also the case for self-control that if you use it, you can do that for a while, but you cannot do it unlimitedly, right? So you can use self-control to control impulses or temptations, but if you're just constantly, well, I wouldn't say bombarded with temptations, but you constantly have to do something that really requires self-control, then at some point your ability to do that will break down. And the second important analogy of self-control and a muscle is that you can actually train it, which of course is a good thing. So if you are, well, training your self-control, if you're doing that like every day, let's say, you can actually get somewhat better at it. So again, these are important insights into our ability to delay gratification and to exert self-control. But I would say that they're not quite patience, and I wouldn't necessarily say that these authors have tried to reduce patience to those qualities, to those abilities, but that's definitely what they focused on. And only very recently quite recently have psychologists started to focus on human strengths and virtues instead of human limitations, their malfunctioning, and their disorders. And this branch is called positive psychology. And also only in a journal of positive psychology have I found an excellent research article that has focused exclusively on patients. It was an article by Schnittgen and Immens, and they have argued, like me, that patience is not the same as self-regulation and delay of gratification. And they've also said that it's also not just the opposite of impatience. So it's not just that you don't fail to delay gratification and so on, but that patience is really a quality that goes beyond that. And in this article, I've also found, for at least as far as I can tell, the best definition of patience in the Western tradition, and it's been by Thomas Aquinas. So I would like to read you what he has said about patience. Quote, "A person is said to be patient if he acts, or because he acts in a praiseworthy manner, by enduring things which hurt him here and now, and is not unduly saddened by them." So, having established this definition of patience, we can now have a look at the psychological research on patience. So, I've been looking for psychological research papers on patience, so that papers that really talked about patience and not about these other constructs like delay of gratification, as I told you before. And I've really found only a few scientific publications. And I would like to now only share two studies that I've identified that I think are really worth sharing, because we will learn a lot about patience and how it relates to other character strengths and personality traits and emotions. And the first study was conducted by Schnittgen and Immens in the year 2007. And what they've done is they have done something that a lot of psychologists do when they want to develop a questionnaire. So they basically use a lot of items, basically a lot of statements about patients or some statement that can describe the patience of a person, and then they let people agree or disagree whether they feel like this statement describes them or not. So, for example, a statement was, most people would say that I'm a patient person, right? And so what they did is they developed a lot of those statements or items and gave them to people. And then what they did is they saw how strong how they correlate, so how strong their relationship is between each other. And then they used a statistical procedure that helps you do two things, or like basically it was a factor analysis, which is the statistical procedure. And what you can do then is you can then see that there might be some underlying factor or dimension of patients. So if you have items that are very strongly related, you can assume that there is an underlying factor, an underlying dimension of it. And that's something they did and they found. So they have identified two factors. One was evaluation of one's own patience and patient behavior. And another factor was called belief about the importance of patience. So for the first factor, this evaluation of one's own patience and patient behavior, an example of an item was, most people would say that I'm a patient person. And for the second factor, beliefs about the importance of patience, one item was called patience is a characteristic that I admire in others. So maybe you can already see that it might be slightly different, but the factors also correlate with each other, right? And so having established this questionnaire, basically they also reduced the amount of items with this procedure, but then having established this questionnaire, now only consisting of the 10 best items, they gave this questionnaire again to a lot of participants, and then they also gave them a lot of other questionnaires and saw how the relationship is of patients with all these other psychological constructs. And the first very interesting question is how patience relates with other character strengths, right? Since patience is a character strength. And luckily, there was some previous work of other psychologists who have themselves identified a lot of character strengths and then developed a questionnaire for those. So actually, in the study, there were 24 other character strengths. And then basically, the authors of the study saw how the correlation was of patients with these other character strengths. And so just a quick note, how the authors defined character strengths, since, there's a lot of character strengths, but maybe not everything is a character strength. And what they said is that this character strength, it has to be, in order to be a character strength, it has to be fulfilling to the person. It has to be morally valued by society and others. And it also shouldn't diminish others, right? It's not enough. It's not good if it's just fulfilling to you, but actually diminishes others. And there were a few other further criteria, but I think that's just a very short summary, so you will get the idea. And then the authors really did this statistical analysis of all these relationship of patients with these other character strengths. And I think that there's two really important results here. The first is that patients actually correlated positively with all the other character strengths. So correlated means if you are more patient, you will also have higher levels of forgiveness or modesty, for example. But just a quick side note, it doesn't necessarily mean, correlation doesn't mean causation. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it is your patience that causes you to be more fulfilling or modest. more forgiveful, higher levels of forgiveness, or higher levels of modesty. It just means that there's an association. So just because we see that certain variables have a relationship with each other, doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other. In order to investigate that, in order to confirm that, you will have to do an experiment where you make people more patient and see whether it causes to the rise or an increase in the other variables. So that's just a quick side note, but I think it's important if we talk about all these relationships between variables and constructs. But still, nevertheless, I think it's an important insight that patience is positively related to all other character strengths. Actually, it is positively related and significantly, but only, well, small to moderate effect sizes, so not in an extremely strong way, which I think is also important, and which brings us to the second important insight. I think that even if you would combine all the other character strengths in order to predict how patient a person is, you could do that. So a prediction in the sense that, of course, your prediction gets better. You will be more likely to predict how patient a person is, but that prediction will not be perfect. And so what that means is patience is not reductible, cannot be reduced to all these other character strengths. So what the authors actually found is that all the other variables combined, even these 24 variables, can only account for 26% of the variance of patience. So I know that this is a bit of a technical formulation, but it should just give you a rough estimate of like how strong this association is. And I think the most important insight here isn't necessarily, how many percent it can be accounted for, but the important insight is that patience cannot be reduced to other character strengths, even if it's associated with them. So a second important category of psychological constructs the authors looked at was personality. So how does patience correlate with personality? And here the authors used a very prominent model in personality psychology called the Big Five. And so the Big Five is, in a way, a list of 5 personality traits. And why are they big, or why is this model so prominent? Well, it's again based on a statistical procedure that I've just described very quickly just before. And again, without going into the details of it, I will just describe it very quickly so you can get a sense of the model. And so if you have the question, how can you describe personality, and also how can you not avoid using 1,000 different personality traits, right? Because there's many words, and the question is, how can we reduce that to a few useful words or traits? Then, of course, the question is, how can you do that, or if you can even do that? And that's something that the personality psychologists in the past have asked themselves. And what they've come up with is this idea of basically using every word in the English language that could describe personality, and these were thousands of words, and then give those words to people, and then they have to describe themselves of, let's say, how reliable they are, and then also do that for many, many more words. And then they did the fact analysis, also basically the same thing that I've told you just before, to see which words are very strongly associated with each other, and then see, okay, can we reduce that to maybe an underlying trait. So let's say if you are very reliable, you're probably also going to be very conscientious or hardworking or orderly. Or another factor might be if you are very compassionate, you might also be kind, empathetic, etc. And so the result of this factor analysis basically was this Big Five model. And why those traits are interesting is that those factors seem to really be independent of each other. And that's very useful because if we have independent factors, right, we can kind of predict things, how people feel, how they behave, because if they would be dependent, the second factor would not maybe predict something new, right? And so if you have five which are quite independent and you can combine all those, you can predict a lot of behavior much better in this model. And I will describe all those factors to you, but I will do that step by step when I now tell you how patience is related to those. So if we talk about the first of those Big Five personality trait, it's called neuroticism. So that's the tendency to experience negative emotions. So it turns out that all those negative emotions seem to be correlated strongly with each other. So you know, people who have high neuroticism, they tend to worry, but they also tend to be anxious or even have anger or other emotions. And patience was negatively correlated with neuroticism. So people who are patient, they have less worries, for example. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that from this correlation we can conclude that patience causes you to have less worries, but it is one potential reason why that could be the case. Another reason for that could also be if you have worries, it might also be hard to be patient, right? Just an example. A second factor is extroversion, and so that's basically the tendency to be sociable, but also to be socially skilled. The people who are extroverted, they find it more easy to make friends, to make new friends. They also tend to have more positive emotion and seem to be assertive. And here, patients did not have a significant correlation. Then we turn to agreeableness, and agreeableness is the tendency to be compassionate, kind, for example. But yeah, so that's something that agreeable people are. And here we actually saw a positive correlation with patience. So here, people who are more patient are more compassionate, kind. And here I thought one reason could be that, of course, if you are patient, it might be easier for you to be kind and to have empathy. Then the fourth factor is called conscientiousness, and that's people who work hard, they're industrious, but they're also quite orderly and organized. And here there was no significant correlation with patience. And that's actually something that surprised me quite strongly, because I also believe that, well, if you're patient, you know, you are hardworking, you don't just have short-term gratification. But I think what it shows again is that patience is not necessarily the same as delay of gratification. And well, I guess it has something to do with patient also having something to do with enduring suffering and taking perspective of the temporal progression of things. And you might be also hardworking, but maybe not so patient in achieving your goals. And then the fifth factor is called openness. And openness is the trait or the tendency to prefer, well, new things, or to like to try out new things. People who are open, they also tend to like philosophy and art, and go to new places, try out new things. And here there was also a positive correlation with patience. That's also something that surprised me a bit. And here, well, the authors, one explanation they give, like that it could be for this reason, is they say that they open-minded people, they might be willing to put up with difficult things, challenges, in order to to have new experiences, and that might be related to patience. I thought it might also be helpful if you are open-minded, so to say, that it might be easier for you to put things into perspective, and to, not just while you're suffering, just suffer, but really also see that from another perspective and give it some meaning and some new interpretation. And that seems to be something that patience is about. And so these are the 5 correlations with the big 5 personality traits, which I think are interesting and help us understand patience better. And here there was also a parallel result, parallel to the result with the character strengths before. And what the authors again did is they tried to predict patience from all those 5 personality traits. And again, they found that, yeah, of course, you can have a little bit of a better prediction of patience, but it's again not so strong that you could say that you can reduce patience to personality or to the big 5 traits. So here, similarly then to the character strength, all the big 5 traits together could only account for 25% of the variance in patience. So as a whole, we can say that patience, yes, it has something to do, correlates with character strength and with personality, but cannot be reduced to those. It's something, a unique virtue, right? So besides character strength and personality, the authors also looked at many more psychological constructs with which patients could correlate, have relationships. So there were really many more, but because there are so many, I have done a selection of psychological variables that I think are particularly valuable in helping us understand patience and its psychological effects. So I'll just give you a selection of further variables that the authors of the study have really investigated. And the first I would like to share is self-control. As the name just says, it's the tendency or the ability to control yourself. Very basically what I've defined at the beginning of the episode. And here we find a positive correlation, actually quite a moderate or almost high correlation with patience. And so here we could say that yes, patience is related to self-control, but also very importantly, it's not an extremely high correlation. It's not even really a high correlation. And so what we cannot say is that even from this empirical perspective, even from the data, we cannot say that patience can be reduced to self-control. But yeah, it contributes to it. People who are patient, they have more self-control, and people who have self-control have more patience. That is true. Then another important psychological construct, I think, is mindfulness. So here it's really how mindful you are. Basically, if you meditate, right, you are able to maybe just observe your emotions without necessarily falling into them, and to basically accept what you experience, to be aware, to be focused in the moment, and so on. And here we find again a quite, well, moderate to high correlation with patience. I think that's also quite significant. And I think that, well, it makes sense because if you're in the moment, so if you're mindful, if you're in the moment, then, well, instead of waiting for the future to come, right, it's easier to be patient. And also, mindfulness has to do with accepting your state, also your emotional state here and now, not judging your experience, which is something you might do when you are impatient, right? If then you might think that, well, I am suffering now. I don't. Well, it's not good. I want to have something else, so maybe I will have to have this thing in the future as fast as possible, right? So again, I think it makes a lot of sense. Actually, there's also been an explanation offered by the authors, which I also think is very interesting, because they've said that mindful people, they estimate time, the duration of time, differently than people who are not so mindful. And what we know from psychological experiments is that when people are absorbed in a task, so they're really focused on the task, and then if you ask them later how long the task took, how much time it took, then they drastically underestimate the duration of the task. And here I think that it makes a lot of sense that it's related to patience as well, because if you are mindful, and even if, you know, maybe it's not such a nice state you're in, you will still not feel like it takes forever and it's unbearable to bear it, and you have to change it and so on. But on the other hand, or rather, you go through it, and you don't even feel that it takes such a long time. And of course that makes it much easier to be patient. Then we go to a new group of psychological constructs, and here I want to talk about positive affect and negative affect. The first thing which is interesting is that, well, they are two constructs which are actually quite independent, and that's something that I think is counterintuitive, because if you could think that, well, if I have a lot of positive emotion, then I just have less negative emotions, and vice versa, right? But that's not necessarily the case. That isn't the case. If you look at, well, all those questionnaires, you see that it's quite independent, so it's still possible that you have positive emotions and negative emotions, and the opposite is also true. So you could have not so many positive emotions and not so many negative emotions. So that's why we look at those variables independently from each other, separately from each other. And when we come again to the relationship of patience with positive affect now, we see that there's no significant correlation. So patience doesn't seem to make you happier. Patient people aren't happier. But what is interesting is that patience is related to negative affect. It correlates negatively with negative affect. And that means that, people who are patient, they have less negative emotions or affect. And I think that, well, that makes sense. We had defined patience as also the ability to endure suffering. And so even if you have, if you are suffering, if you have some negative emotion, right? What patience does is it serves as a buffer against negative emotions. So it maybe not necessarily mean that you don't have any of them, but you have fewer or less intense than if you are impatient. And then a last psychological construct I would like to mention is gratitude. And here we find a positive correlation of patience with gratitude. And I think a good explanation is that if you are grateful for what you have, and you can live in the moment with what you have, it might be easier to be patient especially in difficult times, where you might then say that, well, I'm maybe suffering, I'm impatient, I have to have something else in the future, I need to have it now because I'm suffering in the moment. Instead, it's probably better if you can be grateful for some things you have, and then that might help you be more patient. So now I would like to turn to the second study that was published by Schnittke in 2012. So she's actually also the author of the first study. And what she did in the study now is develop a new patient's questionnaire. You might be wondering why a new questionnaire now, even by the same author, but the goal was to really differentiate patients much better into different dimensions, and also because there might be different life situations or challenges that might require different kinds of patients, so to say, or that might of course have something to do with patients, but might be a bit differentiated. And so for that reason, there were again there are many more items being generated and given to hundreds of people, and then there was again a factor analysis, so this statistical procedure that allows you to identify several factors or sub-dimensions of patients. And yeah, indeed, it was the case that there were different factors. There were 3 of them in this case. So that's why the questionnaire is called 3-factor patients scale. And the factors are called, well, first, interpersonal patients, which I thought was interesting, that you can have patients towards other people. One example of an item measuring that is called I am patient with other people. So yeah, quite straightforward. Then there was a second factor called life hardship patience. So of course that makes sense. If your life is hard, you need patience, as we have seen also in the definition of patience. And an example here is I am able to wait out tough times. And then the third factor was called daily hassles patience. So the frustrating situations maybe in your day-to-day life. And one example here is, in general, waiting in lines doesn't bother me, which I guess is something that we can relate to in our day-to-day life. Or it might bother you as well. And now when we have this new questionnaire, we can again, of course, see how it relates to other psychological constructs. But don't worry, I will not just repeat the same psychological constructs as before. There are some new ones which I think are very interesting to look at. But before I get to that, there's just one category of constructs that we somewhat touched before, the Big 5 personality trait model. But there's something new I want to share, namely the relationship not just with the patients in general, but really with the sub-dimensions. Here, actually, it was the case that it wasn't just correlations that were used, but another statistical procedure called multiple regression, which is also a kind of correlation where you predict patients, for example, but what you do is you can use multiple variables, and then each variable is investigated with regards to its unique prediction for this other variable, patients. I know it's just a technical formulation or a side note. I just want to be sure that I give you all the information. And it's funny because if we have the Big 5 traits, which actually should already be independent, there shouldn't be such a difference towards the correlations. But that's really just a side note. and I will not really talk about the influence of or the correlation of personality traits, the big 5 personality traits with this patience scale, because largely or roughly speaking, it was the same as the one I told you before with the other patience questionnaire. There was a small difference. Extroversion here had a negative correlation with interpersonal patience, and conscientiousness had a positive one, but the effects are really quite small, so it's not such a big difference to the other questionnaire. But really, that's kind of like the basic of it. What I really want to turn to now is the correlations with the specific sub-dimensions of patience. And here you could go into like different numbers and all these kind of details, and I will just focus on just very few points here, which is the first is I will just give you which personality trait had the strongest association with the patient's dimension. And in the case of interpersonal patients, that was very clearly agreeableness. So there was a strong positive correlation of agreeableness with interpersonal patients. So that means that people who are empathetic and compassionate, they have much more interpersonal patience, but also the other way around, right? And I think it makes sense. So if you are able to be patient with others, you are also able to have more empathy towards them. And I guess the other way around as well, if you have empathy, that might help you be more patient with other people. If we look at the other 2 dimensions of patience, so life hardship patience and daily hassles patience, there the strongest correlation was with neuroticism. So if you have high neuroticism, if you worry a lot, for example, then you have less life hardship patience and less daily hassles patience. Whereas if you have high patience levels on those dimensions, you have less worries, or less negative emotions in general, which I think makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to the relationship of patience with well-being, which I think is something very interesting and valuable to look at, because we would all like to have a high well-being. So in the study, there were again correlations between patients and questionnaires of well-being, different indicators of well-being, and it was also differentiated between the different dimensions of patients that we talked about. And it wasn't just these normal correlations, but multiple regressions, which means that all those 3 patients dimensions were predicting the well-being variables. But what we will see is the unique prediction, the unique influence, so to say, on those variables. And so I will just go through these 3 patients dimensions and tell you which unique relationship they have with well-being. So the first patients dimension is daily hassle patience, and it had a positive correlation with life satisfaction and a negative correlation with depression, which I think is, well, interesting, and it also makes sense, because if you have in your day-to-day life, you have a lot of things that frustrate you, that call for your patience, then if you have this kind of patience, that can buffer you against frustration and then protect your well-being, so to say, so you don't get depressed and you're still satisfied with your life. And then when we come to life hardship patients, there were also some unique correlations, and it had a positive correlation with hope and a also a positive correlation with self-esteem, which I think again makes sense because even if you go through a difficult time in your life and you have this kind of patience, then it can also buffer you and can help you to maintain hope and also a sense of self-worth even when times are hard. And then when we turn to the third patience dimension called interpersonal patience, it also had a unique correlation, and namely a negative correlation with loneliness. And what that means is, well, if you have this patience, you're less lonely. And again, I think it makes sense because if you are patient with others, you also have, well, you will be less lonely, you will feel less lonely, maybe you will feel less disconnected to others if they themselves maybe have problems or show maybe some behaviors to you that maybe aren't so good, that demand your patience. And what I also thought is that it could be interesting because that if you have interpersonal patience, it could also help you keep a positive relationship with those other people that maybe, go through a difficult time and demand your patience, so you will feel less lonely. But besides that, interpersonal patience also had some positive correlations with hope, with life satisfaction, and with self-esteem. And so if we look at it broadly, the big picture, we see that interpersonal patience seems to have the most correlations with well-being measures. So it seems that this seems to be the most important for having a high well-being. And again, I thought that it might really be associated with a relationship. So if you can be patient with others and thereby remain or keep your positive relationships, then through that maybe you can also keep your well-being because you still have positive relationships, and that has a positive impact on your well-being. So now I would like to come to the second study that was also published in the same publication. And in that study, the question was whether patients can actually increase well-being. And it wasn't just a question of whether patients and well-being correlate, which we have seen before, they do, but whether patients can also predict well-being in the future, and whether that has something to do with how patient people pursue their goals. So maybe it might be that patient people pursue their goals in a different way, maybe in a better way, and that in turn might make them might increase their well-being. And in order to investigate that, the researchers used, also again, questionnaires at the beginning. It was actually during a semester and students were taking part in the study. But instead of just doing questionnaires at one time, they were asked to define goals for the semester. And then multiple times during the study, they were asked, how they felt about the goal. So basically, they were asked, a few questions. They should rate how much patience the goal needed, and many other things like how much effort they were having for this or showing for this goal, or how satisfied they were with the goal achievement or where it is at the moment, and how much progress they made, and so on and so on. So they did that multiple times, and so the data could then be analyzed in a more sophisticated way, or at least you could see whether patients at the beginning could really have effects even further along the way during the semester. And that actually turned out to be the case. So patients at the beginning was able to predict how much patience they had for the specific goals, which makes sense, of course. But then it went further, so patient people, they also showed more effort for their goals, and even also rated that they made more progress and that they also were more satisfied with their goals. Here, I think you could ask the critical question whether that was really the case, that they actually gave more effort, that they made more progress, that they were more satisfied, or could it also be that if you are patient, maybe you tend to be more satisfied just as it is. You think you make some progress even though it's small, or whether it was kind of a mixture of the two. So kind of like real and subjective in a way. Still, I think the result is important. But the authors didn't stop there. They also did another statistical procedure called a mediation. So what that means is that you look at the correlation. So for example, whether patients can predict life satisfaction, which it does, as we've seen before, and which it also did in this study. But you don't just stop there, you look whether a third variable can actually explain how that is. So sort of a pathway. So we look at patients, and in this study, it was the case that patients predicted or correlated positively with goal satisfaction. And then in turn, goal satisfaction had a positive correlation with life satisfaction. So that was really the case. So there was a significant mediation, and what that means is that patient people, they are more satisfied with their goals, and then in turn that you could say leads to higher life satisfaction even some time later during the semester. So that's also important, I think, and it really shows the role of not that patients cannot just psychologically be a good thing, but really also have effects on in the real world, so to say, on your goals and how you achieve them, and then coming back to you, leading to a higher life satisfaction, which of course is a beautiful thing. And then the last analysis that were also worth mentioning is again another statistical procedure or analysis basically, which is called a moderation. So here again you have two variables. So in this case you had how much patience the people showed for their goals, and then the goal satisfaction, and there was a positive correlation. So if you are more patient with your goal, you will be more satisfied with your goal. But then you also again look at the third variable, and in this case you look whether changing this third variable, in this case goal difficulty, will change the strength of the relationship between the two. So in this case that was true, which means that if the goals were easy to achieve, patients didn't have such a strong effect on goal satisfaction. But if the goals were really hard to achieve, then patients really did have a strong effect on goal satisfaction, which makes sense, right? Because of course, if much more, if your goals are difficult, then patience is much more needed. And that was also the case when the authors added not goal difficulty as a variable into the moderation, but another variable called obstacles. So, how many obstacles they faced when pursuing this goal. And there was the same pattern. So if you don't have many obstacles, patience wasn't important or wasn't that important. And the more obstacles they had, the more important patience was. So if they were patient and had obstacles, they could still have a high goal satisfaction, which again seems to show that patience is important when life is hard or when it's hard to achieve your goals. But then Patience can help a lot, can buffer against frustration or even against suffering, and still help you to achieve your goals. So now, last but not least, I would like to share the third study that was also published in the very same publication of Schnittke in 2012. And in this study, she actually did an experiment and investigated whether patience could be increased. And this is very important. As I said in the video a few times, correlation is not the same as causation. So even if we see that patience is correlated with other variables, we cannot necessarily say that patience causes that or the other variable causes patience to be increased. There's just an association, and there could be different reasons for that. But if we can do an experiment and really manipulate, so to say, the variable of patience, we can then see, if we then see an increase in other variables, we can then conclude that that is because of patience. So that's really an important point, and also an important question, whether patience can be increased. You might also have been wondering whether that's the case, because so far we've only talked about, well, the associations with patience and the many benefits patience has, or is associated with at least. And well, the question is, okay, if I want to have those, can I actually become more patient, right? And yeah, that's basically the question of this last study. And what the authors did is to invite participants to the study, to a training study. They actually didn't call it patience training, but stress and personality study, because it's quite often in psychology that you cannot just tell participants what exactly you're doing, because then it could be that people start to think about it and then might also have a placebo, right? So maybe if they know that they're participating in a patient study, they think, okay, well, I guess I'm becoming more patient, and then answer questions in the follow-up that, well, okay, I have become more patient, right? And we want to avoid that. We want to really see whether the patient's training itself actually makes them more patient. And so what was done is people were randomly assigned into two groups. Either they had the training or not. And before and after the training, people were asked a lot of questions. Well, they basically had to fill out a lot of questionnaires, including the patient's questionnaire we just talked about, but also other measures like well-being, for example, some of those variables we've met before. And also after the training, they were asked those questions again. And the training consisted actually of, well, 4 sessions during 2 weeks. Each session lasted for about 30 minutes and had 2 components. So it was always a didactic component, which means people were taught something. They were either taught about emotions and their triggers, about emotion regulation, coping with interpersonal stress, and fostering empathy and compassion. And then on top of that, each session also had a meditation. So in the first 2 sessions, it was a guided meditation, and in the 3rd and 4th session, it was a loving kindness meditation, which means that you try to cultivate empathy or love towards yourself and then towards other people. And the result of the study was that, well, patience could be increased, but only in the dimension of interpersonal patience. The dimensions life hardship patience and daily hassle patience were not increased. And I think that has a lot to do with how the training was set up, right? Because it had a lot to do with, well, basically fostering empathy and compassion. And as we saw in an earlier study, interpersonal patience is strongly associated with empathy and compassion. And if you can foster that in the trainings through the meditation, but also maybe through all these things that participants were taught, then that leads to higher interpersonal patience. Well, that's a very good thing, right? I think, well, what has to be said a bit critically is that it's maybe not necessarily so clear through which mechanism that was, because there were so many different things that were taught, and even the meditation session was also put on top of that, and there were different ones. So I guess we don't necessarily know exactly how it went, but the combination of all those training sessions together were able to increase patience. What also was a result, remarkably, I think, is that the positive affect of people who were in this training was increased compared to before the training study, and the negative affect was not decreased, it was not affected. And I think that's very interesting, because it seems to be really the opposite pattern of what we saw before. Before we saw that patience is only associated with negative emotions, so basically with lower negative emotion, patients can buffer against negative emotions. But here it's the opposite, right? Patience, in that case, the interpersonal patience, seems to make people more happier. And I think here it again has something to do with the interpersonal patience and the fact that it's related to empathy and compassion, and the fact that interpersonal patience, of course, is related to relationships with other human beings. And if you have this interpersonal patience, if you can even increase it, what is going to happen is that even the relationships with others can be, well, maybe, I don't know if you can say it made better, but even if other people demand your patience, it will not make the relationships worse. It will keep them in a really positive way. And that in turn, I think, will then also help you being more happy, because of course relationships have a strong effect also on our well-being. So that's really quite remarkable and worth sharing, I think. And also the authors reported that the people who did the patient's training at the end also reported less depression compared to before. And that, of course, is also a very important point. And so I think if we summarize all those studies and effects, we can say that patience definitely has many positive effects, or at least correlations with well-being, for example. And what the second study showed was that it was also the case that it was not just psychological internally, so to say, but patient people really seem to also show more effort in the pursuit of their goals, seem to be more satisfied with their goals, and that in turn seems to also make you happier. And then in the last study I just told you about, we could see that patience can actually be increased, at least the interpersonal patience, and that in turn can help you, I guess, make your relationships better, or protect them against negative influences, even if someone else that is dear to you kind of demands your patience in a way, and that in turn can make you happier.